Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha. Welcome back, young friends, parents and other people joining for this third module in our Gradual Teaching series, part of our Youth Dhamma School. So if you've been following along, we've looked at the talk on giving, so saggakathaṁ. We looked at all the different aspects of giving, the importance of generosity. We looked at it as a factor of stream entry. We also did a little meditation as well. Then we moved on and we looked at the talk on virtue, and we looked at the different aspects, the importance of different kinds of precepts, and why the Buddha encourages virtue. And of course, in that context, both giving and virtue are punya activities, so they're merit making. And in that context, they help us to ascend upwards towards heavenly realms, to a good rebirth, a good destination. Now, as we can see, these talks are linked, and even the subsequent ones after today's talk will also be linked. Now, what we'll hope to get from this session is to deepen our understanding about why the Buddha talks about the heavenly realms and understand it in the context of the other planes of existence. And when we do that, what we're actually doing with this gradual teaching series is helping us to become saggas, trainees. So at the moment, we're still putujanas, we're still worldly, uninstructed beings. So we don't understand why Buddha teaches all these things, and it will become clearer by the time we get to the talk on the Four Noble Truths. So it's really important what we're building here. We're building the foundation blocks for us to then meditate and understand, penetrate, realize what the Buddha really means about all his different aspects of teaching. So let's begin. What we'll cover in this session is we'll look at what the Buddha means by sagga. Then we'll look at what is right view in the context of understanding Kamma and rebirth, because this plays a very big part in why the Buddha talks about heavenly realms. Then to understand that, we'll look at the 31 planes of existence. So we'll see what Buddha teaches on that. And then we'll look at the cause and condition for rebirth in good or bad destinations. And then we'll supplement that with different stories and other teachings that Buddha gives on the heavenly realms. And we'll finish off by looking at the heavenly realms in the context of stream entry. Let's start by looking at what the Buddha means by sagga. So the sagga is the Pali word. And when Buddha refers to sagga, normally what you find is that he's referring to places of happiness. He's also referring to good destination. So you always find when it's explained, it's a good destination, a good rebirth. They're referring to the heavens or the heavenly realms. Sometimes they're also called the celestial abodes. And then of course we find in the Suttas references to Deva realms and Brahma realms. So this is some of what the Buddha explains in his teachings about sagga. Before we look into the different planes of existence, it's probably important to hear some of the Buddha's words. So we're going to look at this from the Sammadittika Sutta, and this is in Itivuttaka number 71. And if you remember, this is Kujuttara Upasika. She was someone that heard many teachings of the Buddha and she recorded so that we could hear them. So this is what is said. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one. This is what I heard. Mendicants, I've seen beings who engaged in good conduct of body, speech and mind, who did not abuse the noble ones, who held right view and acted accordingly. At the breaking up of the body after death, they were reborn in a good destination, a heaven world. Now I don't say this because I've heard it from some other ascetic or Brahmin. I only say it because I've known, seen and realized it for myself. So what's really important about this is the Buddha has actually known it for himself, has seen it for himself and realized it for himself. So as we go through the various teachings that we look into in this session, it's important to know that Buddha is telling us from his direct knowing. It's not something that someone else told him, it's not hearsay, it's actually something he's actually seen and known for himself. And when you know that the Buddha has many knowledges and many abilities, you know that he can see into all these different realms, and that's why he teaches it. He's actually been to all these places or seen all these places through his psychic abilities. So it's in that context to remember that. And so when you have strong faith, strong conviction, confidence in the Buddha, that he is perfectly enlightened, that he is the perfect teacher, that he has seen all these things for himself, has realized them for himself, then that's what you bring with you, what you draw on as you listen to the Buddha's talk, his gradual instructions on these heavenly realms. Let's now look at the 31 planes of existence in order to understand the context for these heavenly realms. So Buddha taught about the 31 planes of existence, and he said it's important to understand that we have all been born in all of these places over many lifetimes. So we have been traveling or transmigrating from lifetime to lifetime as a result of our actions. So if you remember from looking at both giving and the talk on virtue, it's really important that we know that all of our actions, they have consequences, ramifications, and that determines through some very complex formula how we end up reborn in different places. So if you undertake a lot of bad actions, unwholesome actions, then you can expect to be born in lower realms. And likewise, if you are virtuous and kind and generous, then you can expect to be born in higher realms. So when we look at this, if you've been born into a Buddhist family, then you may understand, or you may have heard of some of these places, or you might have heard of all of them. And if you haven't, then this will be new. But the main thing is to understand that Buddha has seen and realized and known these for himself, either through his psychic abilities or through having traveled to these places. So when we look at these 31 planes of existence, it's good to look at it in the context of 3 different groups. So the first group is the sense desire realm, so Kamma loka, and there are 11 of them. And then you look at the fine material realms, so the Rupa loka, there are 16 of them, so that makes 27. And then you have the immaterial realms, which are the Rupa loka, and there are 4 of them. Now what distinguishes all of them is whether they are sugati or dugati. So whether they are happy places or they're unhappy places, miserable places. And what also distinguishes them are the lifespan. So if you look on this table, you'll see that as you go above the human realm, the lifespan gets longer and longer and longer. And in terms of what the Buddha says about these various realms, there is more beauty, there is more happiness, there is more glory, and there's more authority, anything above the human realm. So when it comes to the lower realms, well, you can expect that it's quite miserable. And when Buddha explains the hells, he says he can't even articulate fully how bad it is. And that's not meant to frighten us in order to do nothing. It's meant to wake us up in order to make sure that we understand how we end up in those places. So if we look at the first grouping, which is the Kamma loka, the sense desire realm, what drives that is really the 5 senses. So ear, eyes, nose, tongue, and body. That's what drives these sensual worlds. And so we see that there are 6 Deva realms, and the human realm comes in the middle. And then you have the 4 lower realms, or miserable realms. So those are the dugati. So in the human realm, it's safe to say that we can experience both pleasure and pain, that we see it all. But I think for all these realms, it's very important to see that they all lead to death. So even after a very, very long lifetime, one can fall and die again and be back into the same thing of where will you be reborn again. Now, when it comes to the Rupa loka, which is the fine material realms or form realms, then these are very, as it says, it's very refined bodies. So sometimes they're bodies of pure light, and they're accessible to people who have attained the higher concentrations. So that's when you really develop this path and you get to the higher concentrations. So that's how you get to the Rupa loka. There's 16 different fine material realms, and so sometimes you hear them called devas, but also sometimes you hear them called gods, brahmas. And then the final one is the Arupaloka, of which there are 4, and these are the formless or immaterial worlds. And those are accessible by those who, after they pass away, they've been meditating on the even higher concentrations, like formless concentrations. And the Buddha doesn't speak a lot to lay people about this, but Buddha often warns about having the wrong view, and that's how you end up in those very places that when you finally, after very, very long time, fall from those places, you can fall immediately to lower realms. So there's various stories that you hear from the Suttas about all these different realms. And the most interesting ones are probably in both the Kamaloka Deva realms as well as the Rupaloka Deva and Brahma realms, because you hear a lot about these devas coming to speak to the Buddha, and also the gods coming to speak to the Buddha. They want to know certain things and they have certain questions. And so when you think about these different places, the reason why Buddha talks about heavenly realms in the context of what we are learning is because they get the longer lifespan, but there's also a lot of beauty in these realms. There's also a lot of happiness, and there's also a lot of glory or respect and also authority. So they're actually very, very virtuous beings. That's how you ascend upwards. I think that's one of the main things to know. Sometimes when you hear about heavenly realms, you also hear about people who say, I'm not really worried about heavenly realms or lower realms. I'm just coming back to the human realm. And it's important to also know that the Buddha says that being reborn into the human realm is actually quite rare. And there are a number of suttas, both in the main Pitaka as well as in the minor ones, like he has minor discourses in the Dhammapada, where the Buddha reiterates that it's actually very rare. It's more like a coincidence and quite difficult. And so one of these suttas is the Chigala Sutta, and it's about the sea turtle, the blind sea turtle. And he gives this simile where he says that there's a yoke that's being thrown out to sea, and it's being moved in different directions by the wind. So wind moves it east, then west, north and south. So it just keeps moving in this body of water. And so the blind sea turtle, it only comes to the surface once every 100 years. And so the Buddha asked the monks, if this sea turtle comes up only once every 100 years, what's the chance of that sea turtle actually putting its head through that hole in the yoke? And of course the monks answered it'd be like a sheer coincidence, like a random, rare event. And so the Buddha says this is the same as the ability for one to be reborn as a human, like it's a sheer coincidence, but it's also a sheer coincidence that you're born at the time when a Tathagata has come to the world, and it's also a sheer coincidence that the Tathagata is teaching the Dhamma and the discipline. So all these things come to be, that it's very rare to be born at the time where you hear the Buddha's teachings. It's very rare to be born as a human in order to hear those teachings. And so it's both the teachings and the discipline. And so when you understand that, then you really want to know what must be done. Why do these things happen? There were lay people or householders who had the very same questions as we do at the time of the Buddha. And this particular sutta is the Salayaka Sutta, and it's about the Brahmins of Sala. They had the good fortune to have the presence of the Buddha, and they had the opportunity to ask some questions. So this is the question that they asked. Master Gautama, what is the cause and condition why some beings here, on the dissolution of the body after death, reappear in states of deprivation, in an unhappy destination, in perdition, even in hell? And what is the cause and condition why some beings here, on the dissolution of the body after death, reappear in a happy destination, even the heavenly world? So the Buddha answers them by initially saying, householders, it is by reason of conduct, not in accordance with the Dhamma, but by reason of unrighteous conduct, that some beings here, on the dissolution of the body after death, reappear in states of deprivation, in an unhappy destination, in perdition, even in hell. And then he goes on to say, it is by reason of conduct in accordance with the Dhamma, by reason of righteous conduct, that some beings here on the dissolution of the body after death reappear in happy destinations, even in the heavenly world. So the Buddha is really telling us that if you have good conduct, so this comes back to our Kamma. Kamma is really about our conduct, our actions. Then due to our bad actions, we end up in an unhappy place. And if we have good actions through body, speech and mind, then we come to a good destination. And so that's essentially it in a nutshell. But of course, that's not enough for people to understand. So the Buddha explains a little bit more. Basically, what the Buddha explains to the householders of Sala is that it comes down to 20 different kinds of conduct. So on the unwholesome side, you have 10 kinds of conduct. And on the wholesome side, you have another 10 kinds of conduct. So we are familiar with this. This is dasa akusala, so 10 unwholesome conduct, and dasa kusala, 10 wholesome conduct. So we know that under bodily conduct, we can have 3, which are unwholesome or wholesome. Under verbal conduct, we can have 4, wholesome and unwholesome. And under mental conduct, we can have 3, wholesome or unwholesome. So the Buddha goes through explaining to the householders of Sala the distinction. So when it comes to unwholesome, that means you kill, you take what is not given, you have sexual misconduct. On the verbal side, you have false speech, you have harsh speech, divisive speech, frivolous speech. And then on the mental conduct, you have covetousness, you have ill will, and you have wrong view. And so on the wholesome side, what the Buddha says is you refrain from all of that because you know the repercussions, you know the ramifications, and you know that you are being harmful, you hurt others, you inflict pain. So essentially, we understand this already. We've been through this when we've looked at virtue. And when we've done different meditations, such as the Metta meditation in Metta school, then we know that when we cleanse for these things, this is the reason why. That if we don't cleanse, we are bound to lower realms if we don't correct it. Our sila is poor, our view is wrong. So the Buddha is always emphasizing these things. And of course, the Buddha explains the same thing for the 5 precepts. The Buddha says, mendicants, a lay follower with 5 qualities is cast down to hell. What 5? They kill living creatures, they steal, commit sexual misconduct, lie, and use alcoholic drinks that cause negligence. So if you have those 5 qualities, you're bound towards the hells. And then for a lay follower with 5 qualities that they're raised up to heaven, then the Buddha talks about not killing living creatures, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, not lying, and not using alcoholic drinks that cause negligence. So a lay follower with these 5 qualities are raised up to heaven. So if you remember from our last talk, we talked about the young boy who had a teaching from the Buddha on the day that he passed away, that he came to some sort of misfortune, he was robbed, and then he was killed. Now on that day, the Buddha taught him about taking refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, and he also taught him about the 5 precepts. So for those few hours that he was still alive, he had taken the 5 precepts and determined not to kill living beings, not to take what is not given, not to commit sexual misconduct, not to lie, and not to use alcoholic drinks. His intention was to refrain. And so when he met with the misfortune, he actually went to the Deva realm because of the 3 refuges and because of taking the 5 precepts. So that's a very interesting one, that sometimes people think, oh, he didn't do these things and all sorts of things. But the thing is, one still needs to develop it because he must have got a very, very strong teaching from the Buddha. And so don't just think, oh, by the end of my life, I'll just do that. It's often not so easy when you're bound for death that people don't realize how difficult it is because the faculties start to wane with old age, as well as when you're in the throes of death. And so you can't afford to really leave it even to the last minute because your faculties may not be sharp enough in order for you to take the 5 precepts. Whereas if you live as a householder and you continually take the 5 precepts, then what happens is you're training yourself. So by the time you get to whenever that death point is, and it could be earlier, could be later, it could be very, very far away. We don't know. But when it comes, you're naturally inclining towards the 5 precepts. They're not new to you. And so for that reason, the Buddha always encourages lay householders to keep the 5 precepts. So in that context, it's probably good to talk about this particular sutta, not because it's simply about killing. I mean, this applies to all the precepts. But in this particular sutta, the Buddha talks about qualities. And the reason is it's important to understand what's important about it. So Buddha says, mendicants, someone with 4 qualities is cast down to hell. What for? They themselves kill living creatures. Secondly, they encourage others to kill living creatures. 3, they approve of killing living creatures. And 4, they praise killing living creatures. So with those qualities, you're cast down to hell. Now, if you don't kill, and you don't encourage others, and you don't approve of it, and you don't praise anyone who's killing, then those 4 qualities help you to ascend up to the heavenly realms. So the reason why this sutta is important is because it's actually also part of stream entry, that when you don't encourage others in bad things, and you don't approve of those bad things, and you don't praise those bad things, it means you have the qualities dear to the Noble One. So you don't do it yourself, you don't encourage others, you don't approve it or endorse those bad actions, and you don't praise it, then it's very clear that the Noble Ones would respect you. Likewise, if you encourage in the good ways, you encourage and approve of the good things like keeping sila, if you do all those wholesome things, then what happens is you're all also praised and respected by the Noble Ones and also by the Devas. So often Devas protect those who are virtuous. So this is something slightly different, but also in order for us to refine our practice. So sometimes we keep precepts, but we may also, because they're our friends or they're our family, we may endorse the wrong things, even though we don't do it ourselves. So these are little things that we need to refine in order to make sure we're still on that good path. So we don't encourage, we don't approve, and we don't praise anything that is unwholesome. And so there are many, many stories when it comes to the heavenly realms. So you find stories, there are 85 stories that are in verses in the Vimanavatu. So these are the stories about the celestial mansions. And many of these stories were gathered by Venerable Mahamoggallana, and some were also gathered by Venerable Anuruddha and also the Buddha. But what you hear is that most of these stories that Venerable Mahamoggallana did, using his psychic abilities, he visited some of these realms, and he would ask about how they came to have such a good appearance or such a glow, or he would ask how they came to have such a big mansion. And so these devas, they could tell, they knew their past actions, and so they could recall. It's because they either had very good virtue, like they took the 5 precepts, or they observed on the observance days, or they were very generous, so they made offerings to the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha, or they offered flowers to the Buddha, things like that. They took refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, or even another one was that they rejoiced other people's good deeds. So there are many, many stories also in the main Sutta Pitaka, that when you go to the Samyutta Nikaya, in chapter 1 and chapter 2, you get stories about the dialogue between Buddha and the Devas, the Buddha and the gods. And so you get many, many stories about things that help to confirm at the time of the Buddha how people ascended upwards. You can't really talk about the heavenly realms without also talking about the unfortunate realms. And so we won't go into too much detail here, but it's important to note that there are many stories in the suttas about them. So you have the Petavatu, which is about the hungry ghost realm. There are 51 stories, and it's really the result of cultivating, as we said, unwholesome actions and bad qualities. So again, Venerable Mahamoggallana was able to gather many stories because he could see these petas or other spirits, because they're invisible to our eyes, but with his psychic abilities he could see, and he could converse with them. And he could ask them questions again, like, how did you come to be in this existence? And they could recall their past life, what they did, whether they were stingy, whether they did unwholesome things like bad actions, and what kinds of unwholesome qualities, whether it was envy or jealousy or competition. They actually could explain how they came to be in the hungry ghost realm. And then when it comes to another 2 suttas which are very important, the Balapandita Sutta, that also talks about rebirth in lower realms. So you get also rebirth as a result of being born as animal or even the Titan, the Asura, and also in the hells. And so Devaduta also expounds on that as well. So it's very interesting to get the whole picture. So even though the Buddha talks about the heavenly realms, in terms of Kamma and rebirth, it's good to get the whole picture, because then you can piece it together and it gives you more weight towards why one should practice, why one should take on the Buddha's teaching and try to penetrate it. And so rather than go into Kamma and rebirth in too much detail here, we might have a separate session to look at it in a little bit more detail. One of the other things that the Buddha also mentions in the suttas, and we'll look at this particular one, is the Buddha says it's not easy to be reborn in the heavenly realms. And if you look at the world today, the best way of understanding that is that not many people are very generous and not many people are very virtuous. So if you cast your eye around the world, you see that people don't speak very well. That's the most obvious thing. And when you look at the amount of killing that is done in the world and the amount of misconduct that is done in the world, then you realize this world is one that is not particularly virtuous right now. And with people's minds, people are very angry. So when you say refrain from ill will, that's really a mental thing. But if you look at most people, unfortunately, most people, they're in a lot of ill will and anger. And whether it's in their mind or with their words or in their actions, they want to hurt others. That's the natural inclination of the world today. So when you know that most people are not bound for heavenly realms. Most people right now are very much bound for lower realms. And the rareness of the human birth is something that we've already spoken about. So there's this story of the weaver girl. And on the Sutta meditation series, we've spoken about this before a number of times, particularly as a reflection. And this story is really, just to quickly recap, this story, if you haven't heard it before, it's about this young girl. She heard a teaching from the Buddha when she was about 16 years old. And she was very fortunate that she understood it, that the Buddha was talking about death. And she understood the teaching at that time. And so 3 years later, when she was 19, she would help her father, who was a weaver. And so she herself was a weaver. And she was coming along and she came across the Buddha giving a teaching. So she went towards the Buddha and the teaching. She was only 19. And he saw that this girl was about to die that day. And Buddha had this insight. He could see these things. He had these abilities. And so he gave her a specific teaching on that day. And she actually penetrated the teaching. And it was really very much around the sense of urgency that we don't really know. We know death is coming for all of us. That's a given. When we're born, we are bound to death. But we often think, through our society, we think it's going to be a long way off. And for some of us it will be, but for others it may not. It may be a short time or it may be a medium time, depending on our Kamma actually. And so when this girl received the teaching, she actually attained stream entry. So she penetrated the teaching that the Buddha gave her. And so how she died was, unfortunately, she startled her father when she went into the weaving shed, and the weaving machine accidentally started when he was startled awake, and the shuttle went and killed her by accident. So after that, her father had ordained and become a monk. But the good thing is that she had already attained stream entry. So the story is that, but the Buddha says that blind are the people of this world. Only a few in this world see clearly. Just as only a few birds escape the net, so also only a few get to the world of the Devas. So the net is the net of samsara, that if we don't practice in the right way through generosity and virtue, then it's very rare to ascend upwards. It's very rare to come back as a human. And so what does that mean? It means that most of us are actually bound for the lower realms. So that means asura, hungry ghost, animal, or hells. And that is due to what we do with our time, what we do with our lives. So if we are already seeing for ourselves that we have a lot of unwholesome conduct through body, speech, and mind, then you know what you need to do. And if you know that you have stinginess and other unwholesome qualities, then you need to clean them up. And so that's why we do these meditations like the Metta School meditation, while we do the Vatupama Sutta meditation, while we do all these little meditations that help us to actually clean up. And so when we clean up, it gives us a greater chance or opportunity for good Kamma to ripen in the future. So one of the things right now is whatever is happening to us right now, we are the owner of our past actions. That is what is ripening now. And sometimes we miss that. We have been following the story of Anata Pindaka through this gradual teaching series so far. And we looked at it because he was the foremost male lay disciple of the Buddha in terms of being a donor. We also look at it because he spent a lot of time with the Buddha and received teachings from the Buddha. So we learn a lot from what he had heard from the Buddha. And it makes sense that now that we're looking at heavenly realms, that we look at what happened to Anata Pindaka. And as we know from the Suttas, he was reborn after death at the breakup of the body. He was reborn as a Deva in the Tusita Deva realm. So that's part of the Kamma Loka, the sensual worlds. So before he passed away, he was very, very sick, and Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Ananda visited him. And he had a certain fondness for Venerable Sariputta because as he was getting very sick and going to pass away, he received teachings from Venerable Sariputta that were slightly deeper than he had received before. So Venerable Sariputta was reminding him or telling him, counseling him not to cling to the aggregates, the khandhas, not to cling to the sense faculties, not to cling to the elements. And so he's very grateful for that, and he was recommending or suggesting in a very respectful way that these are the things that would benefit householders to hear such a teaching. So when he passed away, he actually was reborn into the Tusita Deva realm, and he returned as a young Deva to visit the Buddha. And he had a very, very beautiful appearance according to the Suttas. And so after paying respects to the Buddha and illuminating, lighting up the whole of the Jeta's grove, he stood to the side and he basically said to the Buddha, "Oh, blessed is this Jeta's grove, dwelt in by the sagely Saga, wherein resides the King of Dhamma, the fount of all my happiness. By action, knowledge and Dhamma, by virtue and noble way of life, by these are mortals purified, not by lineage or wealth. Therefore, a wise person who sees what truly leads to his own good should investigate the Dhamma and purify himself with it. Sariputta has reached the peak in virtue, peace, and wisdom's ways. Any bhikkhu who has gone beyond at best can only equal him." So after saying that, the Buddha approved. And so when Anata Pindaka, the young Deva, saw that, he paid homage and then he vanished. And so after the night ended, the next day, the Buddha said to the bhikkhus that he was visited by a very young Deva with very beautiful appearance, and one that illuminated the whole of Jeta's grove. And then he repeated the verses that Anata Pindaka had stated. And Venerable Ananda had said, "Was that Anata Pindaka? Or was that young god the one that must have been Anata Pindaka?" And the Buddha said, yes, you're right. You came to the right conclusion. So that young god was Anata Pindaka. So it's a very heartwarming story because we see how when you conduct yourself in the right way with generosity, not stinginess, when you cultivate virtue, when you lean towards Buddha Dhamma Sangha, you get the fruits of that practice. You get the fruits of that. And it's inspiring for us to know that there were people at the time of the Buddha that were following the Buddha's instructions, who were very suvacha, like easy to instruct for the Buddha, obedient, willing to listen. And so we know that that's how you ascend upwards, that someone that we have spoken about as we've gone through, someone that is renowned in the world of the Buddha's time, has ascended upwards. And also we know that he was a stream enterer, so he's also safeguarded. It's actually really important to know the importance of stream entry. So one can ascend upwards without stream entry, or one can ascend upwards with stream entry. So when you are a stream enterer, you can be reborn no longer in the lower realms. It could be human birth or above. But what is important is that stream entry safeguards you, as we've spoken before, from countless lifetimes of pain and suffering. Whereas if you enter the stream that you have corrected your view, then what happens is that you only have a maximum of 7 lifetimes. So you've restricted the amount of dukkha to only 7 lifetimes. Now, if you ascend upwards without stream entry, then the ability to fall back down even to the lower realms still exists. And so that's why stream entry is actually seen more favorably than simply just ascending upwards. And so the encouragement to lay people is always to enter the stream. So the story of Kala is where the Buddha really talks about it. He has this verse that says, sole sovereignty over the earth, or going to a heavenly place, or domination over the entire world, the fruit of stream entry is superior. So Buddha clearly says it, that it's really important to enter the stream. It's superior. So the story of Kala is really about Anata Pindaka's son. He did not gravitate towards the Buddha and the teachings, and so Anata Pindaka kind of tricked him, and eventually, out of not wanting to shame himself, Kala eventually received the teaching, was able to finally understand, and so he entered the stream. And so that's where Buddha actually gave this particular verse. Now, Kala wasn't a bad person, it's just that he didn't incline towards the Buddha's teaching. And so what he did was he kept avoiding going to the monastery, kept avoiding being in the presence of the Buddha and the Sangha. So he wasn't a bad person. But essentially, by the end of it, he had heard the teachings of the Buddha, and his faculties weren't sharp. So it took him a long time to memorize and to fulfill what the Buddha had given him as a teaching. But by persisting and by eventually mastering what the Buddha had given him, he actually realized the Dhamma. So even though he didn't really want to know, didn't want to penetrate the teaching, he eventually got there. And so that's the thing, that one can talk about the heavenly realms and they sound really good because of the long life, the beauty, the happiness that is greater than what you experience here. The respect and glory, the authority, all those things. But when it comes to the danger, one is still in danger. And that's what we're going to cover when we go on to the next part of the gradual instruction. We'll be looking at the danger of sensual pleasures and things of that nature. And it's largely because when you ascend upwards, most people want to ascend upwards because you get to enjoy more. That's natural. The fruit of being virtuous and generous is you get the good result of that. But one mustn't misapprehend that it's simply that. The Buddha always warns about falling and falling because you don't understand the true nature of it. So we're going to get to that in our next module of this gradual teaching series from the Buddha. But the main thing to understand from this particular story is that the Buddha emphasizes that entering the stream is superior. And so when you cultivate giving, generosity, when you cultivate virtue, then that really helps towards entering the stream. Those are factors towards stream entry. In the story of Kala, we saw that the Buddha said that the fruit of stream entry is greater than being born into the Deva realms. It's greater than being the king over the whole earth. And it's greater than being sovereign over all the worlds, over everything. then you realize that there's something very important about the Buddha's teaching, that there is something, as we said, that is higher than simply ascending to heavenly realms. So in that context, the Buddha gives a teaching to the monks in the Devaloka Sutta. This is in Anguttara Nikaya. And the Buddha basically says to the monks, if wanderers from other teachers ask you, did you lead the spiritual life for the sake of being born into Deva worlds? Like, is the teaching about the Buddha simply about being reborn in Deva worlds? Wouldn't you be humiliated, troubled, or disgusted? And the monks answered yes. And so the Buddha then says that you would be disgusted with the celestial lifespan, the celestial beauty, the celestial happiness, the celestial glory, and the celestial authority. But you should be more troubled, humiliated and disgusted by if you have misconduct with body, speech and mind. And so that's very telling, that as we gradually develop on this path, that the aspiration starts to turn. Like, as you develop more wisdom, more understanding of the Buddha's teaching. So as lay householders, we're still only unlocking some of those Buddha's teachings. But as you develop further, Buddha re-emphasizes that people ordain not simply to be reborn into Deva worlds, it's actually to have path and fruit, and to actually understand and penetrate the teachings further in order to realize Nibbana. So that's in the background of how we learn this teaching about heavenly realms, that there's more to it than simply understanding that there is celestial beauty, lifespan, happiness, all those things. And so it's a very, very important point to make, even for lay householders, to understand that. We now come to the end of our session on Buddha's gradual instructions on the heavenly realms. And of course, there's always more to say because there's so many teachings that the Buddha gives. But we might have a few additional or bonus sessions, one of which will be Kamma and Rebirth, because I think it will help to deepen our understanding. The other one is on the story of Sumana Devi, who is Anata Pindaka's granddaughter. We'll also have a separate session on the pure abodes, because this might be an inspirational session. And then we'll have a look at learning to meditate, recollecting the Devas. So that's another one of the things that the Buddha recommends as a meditation. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you well. Teruan Saranai.